I still remember the first time it happened. I was 26. I hadn't been sleeping well for a while. It was one of those restless nights. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but then I felt it. Something was watching from the dark, absent eyes upon me. I tried to move, to make out what was waiting in the dark, but something was pressing hard against my chest, too heavy to breathe. Whatever it was getting closer, close enough to feel its breath on my face. The pressure grew heavier, and for a moment I thought I was gonna pass out. She has been described the same way across cultures for centuries. And the most unsettling part is that all these cultures seem to be describing the same phenomenon through different continents, through different centuries, and through different beliefs. The experience seems almost identical. It begins the same way, in a state half awake, half asleep, nothing out of order, making a sudden entrance. No footsteps, no creaking door. Just a slow, creeping sensation that something is not quite right. Awake in bed, unable to move, as if your arms, legs, and chest were pinned down by some massive force. Even your eyes are fixed in place, and the air becomes rare, heavy, dense, making it hard to breathe. An intense weight on top of you is suddenly noticeable. From Scandinavia to Fiji, through Turkey and China, it's described the same way. An intense suffocating feeling of something pressing on your chest. Not a vague heaviness, a presence. Something sitting on you, pressing down until you can no longer bear it or scream for help. It is described as a struggle, as if your lungs are being restricted. Trying to inhale just makes you more desperate, breath catching halfway. The panic builds. Your heart begins to race as the mind tries to search for a rational explanation, but the body is completely disconnected, almost like it's still asleep. In Scandinavian tradition, the entity doesn't simply cause nightmares, she rides the sleeper. The word itself is even tied to the idea of crushing, pressing, riding the body in the night. In Canada, New England, and other parts of the United States, the Old Hag does not ride, she sits on you. The detail is consistent, intimate, and physical. In the islands of the South Pacific, the interpretations may differ. In Fiji, they speak of a demon, maybe a spirit of a recently deceased relative, but the experience remains the same, a nighttime visitation marked by an oppressive force and the impossibility to move. And then there is the presence. Even when not clearly seen, it can be felt. This might be the most universal element of all the accounts, a presence that feels aware. Its breath, not a shadow caused by imagination or a vague fear, not a bad dream that dissipates once you wake up. The overwhelming certainty that something else is in the room, something watching through empty eyes, hostile. The descriptions may be different in appearance across cultures. Sometimes an old woman, a demon, a spirit, a shadow, or a mare. But the experience remains eerily aligned, something intruding, violating, not like a neutral presence or curious, but intentional. Sometimes leaning closer, sometimes whispering, but always watching. Often, it can be seen clearly, hiding at the edge of perception, in the corner of the room, or darkness above, barely out of vision. Once the panic rises, the figure becomes evident, so intentional, almost as if about to speak. But you cannot scream. You may be able to open your mouth, or maybe you think you could, but no sound comes out. In some cultures, those nearby sometimes recognize what is happening and shout, "Eat, eat," attempting to prolong the experience, in hopes they can engage with the spirit they think belongs to a relative or deceased person. But this suggests something even stranger, that the presence is not merely a force, but a being with intention. In other places, people are told to curse, to chase it away with authority. But ironically, when this happens, you cannot speak. Your body betrays you. The voice that could chase it away is inaccessible. And so the paralysis continues. Another recurring detail in countless testimonies is the time distortion. The experience feels long, endless. Seconds stretch into what feels like minutes. Minutes feel like hours. Yet the movement finally returns. When the weight lifts, when the presence dissolves, the clock reveals that not much time has passed. Maybe a minute or two, rarely more. Then it's over. The entity vanishes without spectacle, without a dramatic exit or slamming the door. No smoke and mirrors. Just a presence that's no longer there. Just as if it was never there. But your body remembers, heart racing, drenched in sweat, and the lingering fear of closing your eyes. These universal details are difficult to ignore. The accounts emerged long before the internet or global communication. Long before someone in Norway could read a story from Fiji, or a villager in Newfoundland could learn about Japanese folklore. Yet the pattern is recognizable. A shadow figure, overwhelming dread, unable to scream, unable to move, unable to breathe, a perceived presence, and sudden, a release. All these explanations drift into innumerable details and differences, but the presence remains almost unchanged. What in some cultures is seen as punishment, the result of some curse, the consequences of one's own moral shortcomings, or a witch wandering the night. In others, it is spiritual in a different sense, a demon pressing in, or a recently deceased relative coming to finish whatever they left unfinished, a restless presence in need of something from the living. What in certain regions is given a name with no clear origin, a hag, a mare, a figure that exists more as an avatar of the collective fears. In others, it remains nameless. Whatever the case, the experience lingers. All accounts follow the same order, the same sensations, the same violation of one's personal space. It goes well beyond a nightmare. Fear alone does not account for the inability to move, or the sensation of weight, nor the sure certainty that something is lurking in your room, something that feels both internal and imposed at the same time. The more important detail to note here is not why cultures interpret it differently, but the fact that they describe it so similarly. Why do all accounts go through the same markers? Why does the threat take shape of a dark figure leaning over you? Why is the pressure almost always felt on the chest? Why the suffocation, the pinned limbs, the sense of being restrained or ridden? If this was but a figment of the collective imagination, It would be easy to disregard as such. Variation would be expected. Instead, there's a distinct pattern that doesn't change. The details shift at the edges, but the heart of the presence remains. Researchers have tried to make sense of it. They argue that under specific neurological conditions, when consciousness returns before muscular control, the brain might fill the gap with projected images. A presence is constructed, a threat internalized, the paralysis interpreted through whatever cultural references are available to the mind. Others might suggest that stories told for generations provide a template, and when people open their eyes, unable to move, the cultural narrative supplies a form: a witch, a demon, a hag. But that does not fully explain the experience, because accounts continue to emerge from regions unfamiliar with the folklore. Individuals who have never heard the old names still describe waking in the same suspended state, completely aware but completely paralyzed. Certain that something is in the room, they speak of pressure, feeling observed, or a figure close enough to feel deliberate. The recurrence is persistence across countries, across centuries. The same interruption of sleep. In that narrow space between sleeping and waking, something occupies the room. Whether constructed by the mind or arriving from somewhere else remains unresolved, and the pattern itself remains difficult to ignore. For all the theories, all the names, all the centuries of stories, what I felt was something more personal, not so much like a random visitation, but an intentional one. Before I could make out what I was looking at, I felt where it was, close enough to feel its cold breath on my face, close enough to hear it, but no sound came at first. My eyes were open, but the room felt darker somehow. The ceiling above, one that I had seen for years, was there, unchanged. The faint outline of familiar furniture around me was no different. But this time I did not feel as safe in my room. Something was there with me, a shadow, barely visible in the dark. Something that did not belong there. At first, it was only a void, darker than the surrounding shadows, a pit swallowing what little light came from the window. I tried to look for features, legs, arms, something to make sense of what I was seeing, something human to recognize, but there was nothing. The longer I tried to understand, the more I felt it out of reach, until I found its eyes, or rather, where its eyes should have been. Two dark pits, staring at me in the night, completely hollow. Yet I could sense, I mean, I was sure it was watching me with no eyes, from the corner of the room, like feeding on my overwhelming dread, savoring it, enjoying it. When I thought it couldn't get worse, it shifted, changed position at first. Then it started to get closer, then closer. I could hear no steps, no creak from the floorboards, no movement in the air, but I felt it. The temperature dropped little by little as it got closer, until it was close enough to make me shiver. Its face almost on top of mine, its cold, damp breath getting colder. Breath is the closest I can describe it, but it was more like a continuous stream of heat leaving my body and going into whatever that was. Then I noticed the weight. It had been there all along, but I recognized it as soon as my attention moved downward. My chest felt compressed, not with a sharp, sudden pain, but with sustained pressure. Breathing required effort, each breath stopping short, as if drowning in whatever had filled the air. The feeling was centered, steady, and certain. My arms no longer belonged to me. They lay there, useless. It felt more like I had forgotten how to move them than a restraint. I tried to focus, to no avail. I could not move. My body was there, completely aware, completely sensitive to whatever was pushing it, but completely vulnerable. The presence above me did not move abruptly. It did not jerk or lunge. It remained suspended, lingering over my body as though feeding on my fear. I could sense the tilt of its head without clearly seeing the head itself. There was an impression of age in the curvature of its outline, something drawn and elongated, though I cannot say whether that came from memory or confusion. All I clearly remember is the closeness, the feeling that if I could have raised my hand, I would have touched it. The dread did not arrive as panic. It settled slowly, heavy and internal. A recognition that something was wrong in a way that exceeded fear. Panic is chaotic. This felt structured. There was a logic to the terror, a quiet understanding that I was experiencing something that should not be happening, and that whatever leaned over me knew that I understood. The room around us receded. The corners lost significance. The only relevant space was the narrow distance between its face and mine. Time elongated, not dramatically, but enough that each second felt separate. I waited for movement, for escalation, for some sign of what it wanted. It remained there, steady and present, its breath touching my skin, its attention fixed. I tried to speak. The attempt formed fully in my mind. The word was ready, my mouth opened slightly, but the sound did not follow. The effort drained into the air between us and vanished. The realization that I could not call out deepened the pressure in my chest. Breathing became measured, controlled, only by what little movement the weight allowed. There was a moment when I wondered if I had imagined it. The thought appeared and dissolved almost immediately. The cold against my cheek persisted. The presence did not ease. The gaze, however undefined, did not waver. The presence was not fleeting. It endured. I cannot say how long it remained like that. What I remember is the stillness. No sudden gesture, no violent motion, just the sustained closeness. The quiet occupation of the space above me. It felt patient, not hurried, not uncertain. Then, without warning, the pressure shifted. Not dramatically, it simply lessened. The compression on my chest eased enough for a deeper breath to enter. The cold against my skin withdrew. The outline above me thinned into the surrounding darkness, losing density until the room reclaimed its shape. Movement returned gradually. My fingers responded first, then my arms. I turned my head slightly, scanning the same walls, the same ceiling, the same doorway. Everything looked unchanged. The air felt neutral again. There was no visible trace of what had been in that space, but the memory of its proximity remained tangible. The sensation of being examined from inches away did not fade with the outline. Even after I could sit up, even after I pulled the covers closer, the awareness lingered. I found myself replaying the angle of its face, the emptiness where eyes should have been, the cold rhythm of breath near my skin. The room appeared ordinary, the experience did not. And what unsettled me the most was not the shape itself, but the certainty that it had been close enough to touch. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic occurred. There were no shadows moving along the walls, no sounds in the hallway, no repetition of the event waiting for me the next night. What changed was quieter. Sleep stopped feeling neutral. Before that night, laying down had been automatic, a routine performed without thought. The room would go dark, the body would grow heavy, and the mind would surrender without resistance. Afterward, that surrender required negotiation. I became aware of the position of my body in a way I never considered before. Lying flat on my back felt exposed. The memory of pressure centered on my chest made that posture seem like an invitation. I began turning into my side, sometimes on my stomach, arranging myself deliberately as though alignment could prevent recurrence. The adjustment was small, almost trivial, yet it carried intention. The darkness changed as well. It had always been a background condition, an absence that allowed to rest. Now it felt dimensional. Depth within the room became harder to ignore. Corners seemed farther away. The space near the ceiling held more weight than it had before. I found myself studying the outline of the door, the frame of the window, the edge of furniture, confirming their positions as if verifying stability. There were nights when I had to leave a light on, not bright enough to fully illuminate the room, but enough to soften the shadows. A lamp in the corner, the faint glow of a hallway bulb leaking under the door. The presence of light did not eliminate unease, but it reduced the sense of depth. It flattened the room into something manageable. Even then, falling asleep took longer. The moment between being awake and sleep became something to dread rather than fall through. That threshold, the same narrow space where the event had occurred, no longer felt harmless. I would lay there, aware of my breathing, feeling every heartbeat, waiting for the subtle loss of control that signals the body's descent. Sometimes I would resist it, keeping myself slightly alert, unwilling to fully let go. There is a particular kind of vigilance that develops after an experience like that. It is not constant fear, it is awareness. A part of the mind remains active, listening for changes in the air, measuring the silence, the smallest sound, the settling of wood, the distant hum of plumbing becomes momentarily significant before reason restores proportion. Mornings brought light, but they did not erase memory. In daylight, the room returned to its usual dimensions. The walls looked thinner, the ceiling lower, the corners empty. I could stand in the same place where it had been and see nothing unusual. The bed appeared unchanged, the space above held no trace of what had happened, and yet the feeling persisted. The memory of closeness was difficult to dismiss. It did not feel dreamlike. Dreams fade at the edges, they lose detail and coherence as the day advances. This memory remains structured. I could recall the angle of the figure, the sensation against my cheek, the precise location of the weight on my chest. The body remembered even though the mind attempted to rationalize. There were moments, usually late at night, when I would test the darkness. I would wake briefly and keep my eyes closed, listening. Then I would open them slowly, half expecting to find the outline again suspended above me. Each time the room was empty, relief could follow. Measured, quiet relief. accompanied by a subtle disappointment that the world had not shifted in any visible way. The experience alters something fundamental about trust. Sleep requires a willingness to relinquish control. It assumes that the environment will remain stable once you drift unaware. After that night, the act of closing my eyes carried a trace of hesitation. I understood, in a way that felt physical, how quickly control could vanish. I spoke to no one about it. Explaining it would have required language that felt imprecise, describing eyes that were clearly not there, the breath that left no condensation, the weight that left no mark. It would have reduced the memory to something smaller. It felt easier to contain it privately, to allow it to exist without external examination. Over time, the sharpness of the fear diminished. The normalcy of sleeping returned gradually. The lights were turned off again. The deliberate positioning of my body became less rigid. Nights passed without interruption. The event did not repeat. But the threshold never became entirely neutral again. Even now, there are moments when I wake up in the dark and remain still for a few seconds longer than necessary. I listen before I move. I pay attention to the space above me before I turn into my side. The room usually offers nothing in response. The ceiling remains empty. The air feels undisturbed. And yet, the possibility exists in that small pause. The understanding that the boundary between sleeping and waking is thinner than it appears. That consciousness can return before the body does. That perception can sharpen in ways that feel external. The room looks the same as it always did. The memory of that closeness, however, reshaped how I lived in it. Sleep eventually resumed its place in the rhythm of life, but it no longer feels entirely passive. There is awareness woven into it now, subtle and persistent. A knowledge that for a brief moment I was not alone in that space. Whether the experience belonged to the mind or something else is a question that does not press as urgently as it once did. What remains is the shift it created, the quiet reconsideration of darkness, posture, breath, and expectation. The event ended, the adjustment did not. There are nights when nothing unusual happens. Most nights, in fact, pass without interruption. Bedrooms across the world grow dark, eyes grow heavy, and sleep takes hold without resistance. The ritual repeats quietly, thousands of times without consequence. And yet, scattered across centuries, across continents, there are moments when that transition fractures, when consciousness returns before control does, when the familiar geometry of a room feels briefly occupied by something that does not belong to it. Names have been given to that presence. Stories have tried to contain it. Cultures have shaped it into figures, into warnings, into spirits that ride or press or linger. But beneath all of that, that remains in the same narrow interval, the space between waking and sleep, where the mind is aware and the body is not. Most of the time, that space passes unnoticed. What happens there might belong entirely to the architecture of the brain. It might be an inheritance carried through story and interpretation. It might be something else entirely. The explanation, whatever it is, does not change the experience of lying in the dark, unable to move, aware of something inches from your face. Across geography and belief, the descriptions align. Across time, the sequence repeats. A body at rest, a mind that wakes too soon, a presence that feels close enough to touch, and then release. Morning arrives, light returns, the room resumes its ordinary shape. The world continues without acknowledging what happened in that brief interval. But for those who have felt it, that moment never quite becomes abstract. Because once you have experienced the weight of something leaning over you in the dark, the idea of sleep changes slightly. The boundary no longer feels solid, it feels permeable. Most nights remain uneventful. Still, somewhere in the world tonight, someone will wake and find themselves unable to move. They will feel the air shift above them. They will become aware of a presence they cannot name. And by morning, the room will look exactly the same.